These are Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. They were once rich, famous, and successful, arguably the most important artists of the 20th century. They created an entirely new genre, superheroes. Their creation, Superman, became the first and most iconic superhero in the world. By the 70s, Superman was generating billions through movies, cartoons, video games, and merchandise. But at that same time, Siegel and Shuster were broke. Jerry Siegel was working in a mailroom, and Joe Shuster, almost blind from years of drawing Superman, was delivering packages. So, what really happened? Why did the world forget them? And why did two of the greatest comic book minds walk away from the very world they helped build? Both Siegel and Shuster had basically the same origin story. Both came from very poor Jewish immigrant families from Eastern Europe who fled their countries not just to escape the violence and danger those places were experiencing at the time, but also to have a better life. Their families were firm believers in the American dream, the idea that anyone could come to America, and with enough determination and hard work, anyone could succeed. Sadly, when they got to America, things weren't as they thought. Even though it was safer than their home countries, both families would face a lot of hate in their new homes due to their Jewish heritage and would constantly struggle to make ends meet. For example, Joe Shuster once shared how he would have to go from store to store, scrounging for scraps of paper from whatever they threw out so he would have something to draw on. One day, he was lucky enough to find a bunch of unused wallpaper rolls, describing them as a gold mine because the backs were blank, allowing him to use them for a long time. For Jerry Siegel, the situation was equally difficult. His father worked as a tailor and had a small clothing store, but the family barely managed to survive economically. Tragedy struck the Siegels hard when Siegel was only 17 years old. In 1932, his father died of a heart attack after being hit in the chest by a robber in his store. This loss was not only emotionally devastating, but also left the family in an even more precarious economic situation. Without money, Siegel had to work various delivery jobs to help keep his family afloat. Now with that context, let's jump ahead to 1933, when both were in high school. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster were exactly the type of kids you'd expect to be invisible in high school. Shy, with glasses, and more interested in books than sports. But when they met around age 16, something magical happened, as Siegel himself described it years later. When Shuster and I first met, it was like the right chemicals coming together. They shared an obsession, science fiction. While other teenagers worried about dates and parties, Siegel and Shuster devoured pulp magazines, talked about fantastic worlds, and dreamed of creating their own stories. And then they decided to make it happen. In 1933, while they were still teenagers, they launched their own fanzine, short for fan magazine, called Science Fiction. It was amateur, made with limited resources, but it was theirs. Siegel wrote the stories, Shuster illustrated them, and together they distributed their little magazine among other science fiction fans. What they didn't know was that they were planting the seeds of something that would change the world forever: Superman. But their first Superman wasn't the hero we know today. In that same 1933 fanzine, buried in the third issue, Siegel published a short story under a pseudonym called The Reign of the Superman. They took the name Superman from the concept of the Übermensch, or Superman from the German philosopher Nietzsche. This Superman was everything our modern hero isn't: a bald, telepathic villain bent on world domination. He was a homeless man named Bill Dunn, who gained psychic powers from an experiment and used them for evil. The story flopped hard. Nobody cared about him. But for some reason, Siegel couldn't let go of that name, Superman. The following year, something clicked. Maybe it was their own experiences of feeling powerless, Siegel losing his father to a violent crime, Shuster scrounging for paper scraps. But they flipped the entire concept on its head. What if Superman wasn't the villain? What if he was a hero instead? Shuster drew inspiration from the movie stars of the era, Douglas Fairbanks Sr., for Superman's heroic physique and confidence. For the mild-mannered alter ego Clark Kent, they combined Harold Lloyd's everyman appeal with Shuster's own appearance, complete with those thick glasses that made them both invisible in high school. Even Lois Lane had a real-world inspiration, a model named Joanne Carter, who posed for Shuster's illustrations. Little did they know she would later become Siegel's wife. They had created the perfect American immigrant story: an alien who comes to Earth, hides his true identity, and uses his extraordinary abilities to protect his adopted home. And here's something fascinating that I just have to point out. In recent years, it's become incredibly popular to create evil Superman characters. Think Homelander from The Boys, or Omni-Man from Invincible. Although I enjoy these stories, they kinda give the feeling that they think they're breaking new ground, asking, what if Superman was actually bad? As if they're reinventing the wheel. But here's the irony: Superman himself was already the subversion. Remember, Siegel and Shuster's first Superman was literally the villain, a power-hungry megalomaniac who wanted to rule the world. That was the obvious take. If someone had godlike powers, of course they'd be a jerk, right? The real revolutionary idea wasn't making Superman evil. That was easy. That was expected. The shocking subversive choice was making him good. Think about it. In a world full of violence, corruption, and people who abuse whatever power they have, Siegel and Shuster created someone who had unlimited power and chose to use it to help others. Someone who could rule the world, but instead chose to save it day after day, asking for nothing in return. So So when a lot, and I want to be clear, not all, but a lot of modern creators think they're being edgy and clever by making evil Superman characters, they're actually going backwards to the most obvious cynical take. The real subversion, the one that was truly groundbreaking, was believing that someone with ultimate power could also be ultimately good. That's what makes Superman special. Not his strength, but his heart. With their new Superman already designed, Siegel and Schuster thought it would be easy to sell. After all, they had the perfect idea. Who wouldn't want to publish that? Well, apparently everyone. What followed were 4 years of rejection after rejection after rejection. First, they tried to sell it as a comic strip for newspapers. That's where the real money was. Successful strips like Dick Tracy or Flash Gordon made their creators rich. But newspaper editors didn't understand Superman. They considered the idea of a flying man too weird, and that it wouldn't be successful. Siegel kept every rejection letter like they were trophies of his failure. Stack after stack of rejection letters. Meanwhile, they continued living in poverty. Schuster continued collecting waste paper to draw on. Siegel worked delivery jobs to help his family. And every night, when they came home exhausted, they would get together to continue perfecting Superman. Because despite everything, they couldn't let it go. They knew they had something special in their hands. In 1937, after years of rejections, something changed. Siegel and Schuster were no longer the optimistic teenagers who had created Superman. They were 23 now, full-grown men, tired of poverty, tired of being told their idea was worthless. And then another opportunity came. Consolidated Book Publishing had shown some interest in Superman. They sent them a letter. It wasn't exactly a yes, but it wasn't a no either. Finally, some hope. The duo quickly got to work to send an improved version, but Consolidated never contacted them again. The devastation Siegel felt was so profound that, according to different versions of the story, he either burned all the Superman pages in a fit of desperation. Siegel managed to save only the cover by pulling it from the fire, or tore them to pieces with his own hands, leaving only 2 cover sketches. Picture this: years of work, their most precious creation, destroyed by frustration and the pain of rejection. It was the end of Superman. Or was it? Because you see, in 1938, one of those many copies they had sent for submissions had ended up in the offices of National Allied Publications, which would later become DC Comics. Editor Vin Sullivan was looking for something for the cover of the first issue of a new magazine they were launching, Action Comics. He needed something that would make people stop at the newsstand. And there, in that pile of rejections, he found Superman. Sullivan saw the cover, a man lifting a car above his head, and thought this could work. When Siegel and Schuster got the call, they couldn't believe it. Finally, someone wanted to publish Superman. National Allied Publications offered them $130 for the idea and work drawing and writing Superman. What a deal! To put this in perspective, $130 in 1938 is roughly $2,900 today, enough to cover maybe 2 months' rent. So for 2 guys on the verge of bankruptcy, it didn't sound too bad. Plus, they got a job doing what they loved most. Siegel and Schuster looked at each other. They had fought for 4 years. They'd been rejected by everyone. Their families were still struggling, and someone, finally someone, was offering them real money for Superman. So they signed the contract. Action Comics #1 hit the stands in June 1938. The cover showed Superman lifting that car. It sold like hotcakes. Newsstand owners demanded more copies. Kids begged their parents for money to buy the comic. Superman was an instant hit. Soon there was a radio show, animated films, and even toys. In 1942, together they earned around $63,000, approximately $1.2 million in today's money. Siegel was able to buy a house in University Heights and a car. Life was good. For the first time in their lives, they didn't have to worry about money. A year later, in 1943, Siegel was drafted into the army and sent to Hawaii, where he worked for the military newspaper Stars and Stripes. While he was away, something happened that enraged him. DC Comics published a Superboy story, Superman as a Child. The problem? That story was based on an idea that Siegel had sent to DC years before, but which the publisher had rejected. They never bought the rights to Superboy from Siegel because they had never officially accepted the idea. Technically, Superboy still belonged to Jerry Siegel. When Siegel returned from the war in 1946, he and Schuster decided to sue DC Comics. And in response, DC Comics fired them. Remember that contract they signed? It turns out that what they had signed basically said they were selling the idea of Superman to DC Comics. They would no longer own the character, and they wouldn't receive royalties. No money from toys, shirts, or merchandise bearing the Superman logo, and all that for just $130. Yes, they should have understood what they were signing, but they wouldn't be the first or last artists to fall victim to such corporate tactics. They were young, poor, and desperate. Many would have done the same in their situation. This was before the internet. Getting legal advice meant hiring expensive lawyers, something Siegel and Schuster simply couldn't afford at the time. Yes, DC took the risk of publishing such an unusual story for its time, with no guarantee of success. But DC only had that opportunity because Siegel and Schuster had worked for years without payment, taking their own risk that the idea might fail. At some point between a few $1,000s and multiple millions, fairness demands that creators be compensated for extraordinary success. Or at least that's what I think. But what do I know? Anyway, Siegel and Schuster sued DC Comics for $2,000 things. They wanted to recover the rights to Superman, and they wanted ownership of Superboy. But DC Comics had an ace up their sleeve. They had lawyers. Really good lawyers. The ones that cost a lot of money. Money that Siegel and Shuster no longer had after DC fired them. The case reached the Supreme Court of New York State in 1947. The court ruled that DC Comics had legally purchased all rights to Superman when they bought that first story. The original contract, however terrible it was valid. Siegel and Shuster had transferred to DC Comics all of their rights to Superman, including the title, names, characters, and conception. But there was a small victory. The court ruled that Superboy did belong to Siegel because DC had never officially bought that idea. And then DC Comics did something that honestly is an a-hole move. As if to add insult to injury, they removed Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster's names from Superman comics. From 1947 onward, millions of kids around the world read Superman comics every month, but none of them knew who had actually created the hero they loved. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster had been erased from their own creation. Over time, their names were erased from history, and the world moved on as if nothing had happened. What happened after 1947 was devastating. Siegel and Shuster had lost not only Superman and their money-paying lawyers for the lawsuit, but also their careers in the industry they had helped create. After trying to replicate Superman's success with Funny Man in 1947, only this time they would keep the rights to the character. And failing, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster parted ways. For Joe Shuster, the situation became particularly tragic. Years of drawing, hunched over tiny panels with poor lighting, had destroyed his eyesight. By the 40s, he had to draw with a magnifying glass, had destroyed his eyesight. By the 40s, he had to draw with a magnifying glass, otherwise he couldn't see anything. The man was going blind, and he had to take a job wherever he could. At one point, he even made art for an adult magazine, if you catch my drift. But eventually, that gig dried up. By the 60s, Shuster's eyesight had deteriorated so badly that he could barely see. And then came the most humiliating moment of all. One day in the mid-60s, Joe Shuster, now almost blind, struggling financially, took a job as a delivery man to earn some money. And where do you think one of his deliveries took him? The DC Comics building. Picture this scene. Joe Shuster, squinting through his thick glasses, carrying packages up to the offices of the company that had made billions off his creation while he struggled to pay rent. He was hoping that no one would recognize him, but it was useless. He was a legend there. The DC employees were mortified. Here was one of the co-creators of their most valuable character, delivering packages like any other worker. Word quickly reached DC's CEO. Shuster was summoned upstairs, given $100. Ironically, almost the same amount he and Siegel had received for Superman 30 years earlier, and was told to buy a new coat and find another job. It was charity, pity money, for a man who once had it all. While Shuster delivered packages, Siegel's situation wasn't much better. After being blacklisted from comics, Siegel had to find work anywhere he could. For 7 years, Jerry Siegel worked as a typist in the mailroom of the Los Angeles Public Utilities Commission. Every day, the man whose imagination had given birth to the world's most famous superhero sat in a windowless office, typing routine correspondence about water bills and electricity meters. In a later interview with an employee newsletter, Siegel said, "With all the troubles and prolonged litigation I have had, I just wanted to hide out." During the following decades, Superman's popularity only continued to grow. Superman continued being one of the most popular characters in the world. There were TV shows starring George Reeves, cartoons, merchandise, countless comic books, and with each passing year, fewer and fewer people remembered that Superman had been created by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. A whole generation of kids grew up reading Superman comics that didn't have their names on them. For these kids, Superman had always existed. Like Mickey Mouse or Santa Claus, he wasn't created by anyone, he just was. Siegel and Shuster had not only lost ownership of their creation, they had been erased from history. But sometimes, when you think you've lost everything, something unexpected happens. In 1975, Warner Brothers announced that they were making a big-budget Superman movie. And not only that, but by then it would be the most expensive movie in history with a budget of $55 million, which adjusted for inflation would be almost $300 million today. For comparison, Avengers Endgame only cost $50 million more. And that's when Siegel and Shuster decided they had hidden out long enough. In 1975, Siegel and Shuster did something unprecedented in comics history. They went public. In a bold move that shocked the industry, Siegel launched a public protest campaign against DC Comics and Warner Brothers. Siegel wrote press releases that he sent to newspapers across the country. The headlines were devastating. Superman's creators living in poverty while company makes millions. The story was simple, heartbreaking, and impossible to ignore. Several colleagues from the comic industry joined them in support, as they had been treated similarly. What made this campaign different from Siegel and Shuster's 1947 lawsuit was timing. Superman wasn't just a comic book character anymore. He was about to be a major Hollywood movie, with Warner Brothers betting millions on his success. Imagine the headlines if this had continued. Superman movie makes millions while creators live in poverty. Not exactly the kind of press you want for your big Christmas blockbuster. Siegel and Shuster's connections made sure the story reached everyone who mattered. They contacted newspapers, comic conventions, industry professionals. The story spread like wildfire through the comics community and beyond. DC Comics found themselves in an impossible position. They legally owned Superman that had been settled in court in 1947. But moral ownership? That was a different story entirely. Warner Communications, DC's parent company, saw their Superman movie potentially turning into a public relations nightmare. Every interview about the film could become a question about why Superman's creators were forgotten and impoverished. The pressure was immense, and it was coming from everywhere. Comics professionals, entertainment journalists, and even some DC employees were asking the same uncomfortable question. How can you make billions off Superman while the men who created him struggle to survive? In late 1975, DC Comics, after a lot of pressure from the public, agreed to restore their byline credit on all Superman stories. After more than 30 years of being erased from their own creation, Superman created by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster would appear in every comic book, every TV show, every movie. Their names would be immortalized alongside their creation forever. But that wasn't all. Warner also agreed to pay both Siegel and Shuster a lifetime pension of $20,000 per year, later increased to $30,000 plus full medical insurance. In today's money, that's roughly $150,000 annually. It wasn't the billions that Superman had generated, but for two men who had been struggling their whole lives to survive, it was enough.